In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God. Amen. Well, dear ones, as you know, I've been a little ill this week. I'm still kind of recovering, hence me taking the third spot today, and I'm just going to sit through most of the liturgy, but I really wanted to give a homily today because of a saint that I've mentioned to you before that's commemorated today. There are two saints who reposed in the 20th century who reposed on August 15th on the feast of the Dormition of the Theotokos and the Virgin Mary, and therefore their feasts were moved. The first we commemorated yesterday, that was Saint Joseph the Hesychist. And the second is the saint whose icon I put on the podium back in the back of the church, Saint George the Pilgrim. I know I've mentioned him to you before in a little bit of his life, especially if you came to the presentations I did on my trip to Romania, but I wanted to share with you a little bit of a fuller life of his. There's no full life that's been published yet, but in 2007, St. Herman of Alaska Press, in their Orthodox Word, had an edition dedicated to some of the modern saints of Romania. And the longer life in that one was of St. George the Pilgrim. And I thought I would share with you some of the details I learned from there and from some of the Romanian sources that I picked up in my recent trip. So St. George was born in 1846. As a youth, he learned his family's trade, which was to raise cattle. But he was much like St. Cleopa of Romania. If you know about St. Cleopa, when he was a monk at Siastria and he would watch over the sheep, he would spend his days in prayer and reading. St. George would do the same thing in raising the cattle, but his main work was to pray the Psalter. And he prayed the Psalms so frequently that he actually at a young age had the vast majority, and it soon became the entirety of the Psalter memorized. He would carry the Psalter around with him, which was something that he did for the rest of his life, which is why in his icon on the back you'll notice that he's holding a book that is the Psalter. At the age of 24, his parents had him married off to a woman named Pelagia. Right away in his marriage, she recognized that George was a man of deep faith and strong prayer. One of the stories that my wife and I read in the Romanian book about his life was early in their marriage, there was a day in which Pelagia couldn't find her husband. And she searched around the house and was calling out his name and had no response. After hours had passed, she began to grow worried about this. And so she called some of the neighboring townspeople to come search for him and search different parts of the town around the house. Finally, somebody did something that no one expected they needed to. They just simply went to the garden behind the house. A lot of Romanian households have pretty vast gardens where they grow many of their fruits and vegetables. And sure enough, they found that George had been praying there for hours with his arms upraised to heaven. He was so enraptured in his own prayer that he didn't hear anybody calling for him. But when somebody came and put their hand on him and he kind of came to, without saying a word, he just nodded to them and quietly went right back into the house. That was the end of the search. He would spend many of his days like this. He continued to raise cattle, but he was a very, very poor businessman. He would often buy high and sell low because he always wanted to benefit the person he was having some sort of business exchange with. If he thought a certain cow was not quite worth the price it was being asked for, he figured this person must be asking for a high price because they really need the help. And he would scrounge up everything he could to pay him that full amount. When he would sell cattle, even if the person was lowballing him, he figured, well, maybe this person doesn't have anything and that's why they need this cow so badly. So his family was in constant financial straits, but they always made it through. And he taught his wife and his children to constantly seek out the intercessions of the saints and to pray to Christ. And he said that they would always be okay in this, despite the fact that they went through many hardships. In fact, in their first home, they couldn't afford it anymore. They had to live on the outskirts of the city, which is exactly what St. George wanted. It was a chance to go pray more in solitude. But they had to buy a rundown house that they had to build themselves. After 20 years of marriage and 5 children, though, George had the distinct desire in his heart to go and visit the holy places of Jerusalem and to spend some time at monasteries. And so with his children grown and his wife's blessing, he began to trek through Romania on foot until he got to the sea and took a boat to the Holy Land. He went to Jerusalem, and he spent most of his 40 days there at the Holy Sepulchre. And then he began going to the various monasteries of the Palestinian lands, and he went to a particular monastery called the Monastery of St. Xenophon. Here there was a very famous and holy ascetic who lived there. Now that ascetic, of course, didn't speak Romanian. George didn't speak Arabic, and yet that ascetic, when he walked up to him one day, he found him, by the way, this hesychist was feeding a lion. And there was a crowd of pilgrims waiting for him, and he heard his name. George heard his own name being called out. And this hesychist picked George out and through a translator told him that he needed to spend time going to various monasteries here in Palestine in prayer and asceticism until the Holy Spirit called him back to him. So St. George spent a year doing this. 1 month at one monastery, the second month at another monastery, third month at another monastery. And he picked up every virtue and ascetic practice that he found beneficial. And he would practice it like St. Anthony. He would practice it to the point of perfection and then go to the next. After a year, he felt the call of the Holy Spirit to return to this hesychist. And so he did. He returned to him, and the hesychist told him to go into the desert for 40 days and to pray and fast. And he told him that if he could withstand the temptations that were brought to him, then he would continue on to become a great and well-known ascetic, and if not, he would be sent back to his family. St. George went, and much like the scene of Christ in the Gospels, the devil began to appear to him and bring many temptations to him. Some of the temptations, though, were simply annoyances. At one point, St. George, because of course it was hot, the sun was beating down on him, he had his hat on, and the devil took his hat and tossed it a distance. After this happened a few times and George realized what was happening, he relented and said, okay, if this is the battle that God has allowed for me, then I'm just not going to wear a hat. So the devil began to do the same thing with his shoes. Whenever he would take off his shoes, the devil would throw them some great distance. George would trek out to get them, and then he realized this is another attack of the devil. I guess I'll just not wear anything on my feet. And eventually, the devil appeared to him as a great angel of light and congratulated him on conquering all of the machinations of the evil one. George, though, recognized that this was the devil and said he was unworthy of such a visitation. And the devil, being defeated, screamed and ran away. After the 40 days, St. George returned again to this hesychist at the monastery of St. Xenophon, where the hesychist informed him that he would live in a deeper asceticism than even the monks and the nuns in the monasteries. That he would live in incredibly difficult asceticism, never wearing a hat, never wearing shoes, no matter how hot or cold it got, but that he would reach great spiritual heights in the process. St. George took his blessing. He went to Mount Athos, where he spent a year and a half in preparation for the rest of his life, and then he returned home. He returned home very briefly, simply to set in order all of his family matters for his children and his wife. And then, with his wife's blessing again, he began wandering the mountains and the monasteries of Romania. At this point, St. George took on a little bit of a affection for the foolishness for Christ's sake and that type of life. For 3 years, he wandered around until he got to the town of Piatra Neamț, and he climbed up into the bell tower that was built by St. Stephen the Great. And he lived in this bell tower for 30 years, essentially as a stylite. He ate very little. He would give most of the food he was given away. And he would descend the bell tower simply to go to church at night. And from 11 p.m. on, he would spend 5, 6, and sometimes a little bit more, about 7 hours in prayer with upraised arms, often just simply praying the Psalter by memory. Again, he would carry that Psalter with him, and when he was with the people, he would often stop and say, let us read a kathisma, and slowly he would read through one of the kathisma for the benefit of the people. Despite his appearance, which is one of a very shabby and kind of a magey coat that he would wear, despite not having anything on his head, despite not having anything on his feet, and despite this foolishness for Christ's sake that he took on, many of the people began to recognize in him the gifts of prophecy and clairvoyance. And in fact, many would go and seek out his benefit, even monastics, but especially those seeking monasticism. Often when somebody wanted to become a monastic and they weren't sure where to go, they would simply go to Uncle George, as he was known in the town. And Uncle George would look at him and immediately tell him, go to this monastery. This is where you'll find your salvation. Don't go there where you're planning on going. Go to this one instead. And he would know their thoughts and their spiritual state. Many very, very famous future priests and spiritual fathers began their life under his guidance. In fact, the priest and the abbot who really made Sihastria so famous, which is where St. Cleopa and St. Paisi Oladu ended up, was named Father Ionikia Morai. He was first a disciple of St. George the Pilgrim, who guided him for many years and made him into his own kind of saintly figure. We're kind of waiting for Elder Ionikia himself to be glorified as a saint, but he's put on frescoes in Sihastria. I think there's no doubt that he indeed was a saint, and he credited his advancement in the spiritual life to old Uncle George. Again, as I said, he had a bare head and bare feet. Even when it was blizzarding outside, he would walk around with bare feet, and people would often come to him and offer him shoes. They'd say, come, let us buy you some shoes. And he'd laugh at them and he'd say, look, feel my feet. And when they would reach down and touch his feet, they found that his feet were actually warmer than their own, which had socks and shoes on them. He would radiate this heat, even in the winter. He talked about, in this article, how he acquired the unceasing prayer of the Jesus prayer. He said that he struggled for many, many years, but he could never really keep his focus going for too long. But he struggled. And he said that struggle was eventually rewarded by Christ with the gift of unceasing prayer. As he struggled to persevere in praying unceasingly, one day he went to one of the roadside crosses that you see all over Romania, and he went and bowed before it, and immediately he felt this power come from the cross and enter into his heart. And from then on, he had the gift of unceasing prayer. He would either pray the Jesus prayer or the Psalms. It was always one or the other, and it continued on for his whole life, even supposedly while he slept. When he became quite a bit older, people began to guess that he was going to die soon, and they wondered if he knew when he would die. He said, when I die, the bells all over the country of Romania will be ringing. That was his prophecy, that he would repose on the feast of the Dormition of the Theotokos, which indeed he did. When one of his disciples, another holy abbot, decided to transfer his relics to his monastery, he put his relics in a horse and carriage, or a horse-drawn carriage, and began traveling to his monastery. But when they got to the point that they were passing the monastery of Vratek, the horses stopped. They would neither move, nor eat, nor drink. And this abbot understood that this was the place where St. George wished to have his relics placed. So he took the relics inside, where they were placed in a temporary reliquary, and just a few years ago they were placed in a much nicer silver reliquary where they lie today. Again, if you came to the talks on my trip to Romania, you know that I got to venerate his relics. And there were few relics in Romania. There were many that were fragrant, but there were few that were as powerfully fragrant as the relics of St. George. Venerating his relics made me immediately feel this great affinity for him and a great love for him. Because of that, I made sure to buy his longer life, even though it's in Romanian. And it's that life that my wife and I have begun translating, which I ask your prayers that we complete that in a timely manner, that it comes out to be a good and beneficial translation, and that we find a good publisher to be able to share it with the English-speaking world. St. George may look like a character that you look at and say, how in the world am I supposed to benefit from this life? I'm not at any point going to leave my family and go wandering around barefoot, seeking deeper prayer and asceticism. This doesn't sound like a life that I could ever live. I'm never going to live as a fool for Christ. But what you see in the life of St. George is one who had a heart that so burned with love for Christ that there was no normalcy, there was no normality outside of simply seeking Christ in whatever way made the most sense at that moment. He didn't seek to make sense of the world. He didn't seek to make sense of his own life. He had very little plans that he ever made. He simply went wherever the Holy Spirit guided him to love Christ more. It's that burning love that is a call for every Christian, not just the great ascetics who wander the earth and the monks and nuns. Every single one of us in our state in life should seek to be pleasing to Christ in extreme ways, even when it looks crazy to this world. St. George was one who, as I'm always telling you, I don't want you just to pray and to fast, but to love prayer and love fasting. He was one who loved prayer and fasting so much so that indeed he was filled with the grace of God that defeated all evil spirits and sanctified him such that his relics continued to exude a beautiful fragrance today and work many miracles. So again, I ask that you pray that my wife and I can complete this task and translate this book. And if you want to throw in a little side prayer, pray that if we complete this book and it's published in English, that St. George shows his gratitude by perhaps sending us a small portion of his relics, because it would be a great thing to have in this parish. May we have the intercessions of this great ascetic and fool for Christ, St. George the Pilgrim, with us today and always. Amen.